And now it is my true pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, my personal friend and a very distinguished multi-serving ambassador, Edward O'Donnell, I should say. Ed is a distinguished career diplomat. He is currently serving as the co-founder of the Arizona State University Lab for Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security. He's a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies and the Barrett Honors College. He teaches undergraduate and graduate level courses, including one on diplomacy, human rights, and preventing genocide. Ambassador O'Donnell is on the board of the Genocide Awareness Week. He retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2007 after a distinguished 33-year career in Latin America, German-speaking Europe, and other positions in Washington, D.C. He served in a variety of places: Germany, Austria, Panama, Colombia, Paraguay, among others. But he's here tonight based on his position as the negotiating ambassador concentrating on Holocaust issues. I won't go through all of his other distinguished positions or talk to you about his 30-year career in the Army Reserve. But I will tell you that Ed is just a real pleasure. I served with him in Vienna, Austria. Our daughters went to high school together, and I'm so very pleased that he's able to come and talk to us tonight. Ed, the podium is all yours.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for that introduction, and congratulations to all of you for having such a dynamic World Affairs Council. Joyce, President, and the board, you really do great work. I've been a part of World Affairs Councils, spoken to them around the country. This is, I must say, the most dynamic, and you're really a part of the community, and it reflects your commitment to global engagement, and I really congratulate you on everything you've done. So thank you for inviting me to speak to you, and it's a pleasure to be back. I really enjoyed my first visit earlier this year when I talked about the Panama Canal, Panama, and trade. But the topic tonight is about genocide and lessons from the past. This is the photo of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp where over 1 million Jewish people died, went to their deaths from all over Europe. And that's where I want to center my remarks on and start with the ultimate genocide of our history in the Holocaust. The Holocaust, as you probably already know, 6 million souls died in that tragedy from 1933 to 1945. And it was based on anti-Semitism. And it was anti-Semitism that was deeply embedded in Europe over centuries. The canard, the sort of hatred of the other or someone who's different. Jewish communities have suffered for centuries, pogroms in Russia and Germany and across Europe. So it was centered on that long before Hitler came along. And then his Nazi ideology, of course, was terrible and led to Jewish families being put on trains to Auschwitz, and 2 out of every 3 European Jews died during the Holocaust. And so the persecution of the Jewish people started small. It started with anti-Semitism, hate. In 1933, it started with the boycott of Jewish businesses in Germany, and Hitler was trying to get Jewish people to leave Germany. And then later this accelerated and became more and more. It led to the killing of the 6 million people. So for Jewish people, Holocaust survivors, families of the victims of the Holocaust, wherever they're living, in Israel, in the United States, around the world, the events of October 7th, the Hamas attack, was a reminder of what exactly had happened during the Holocaust. And that's what was so shocking and seized the attention and the horror of what happened October 7th. So from the Holocaust, one of the lessons from history is that there are perpetrators, those who are responsible for the killing. There are bystanders in Germany and wherever the Nazi footprint was in Europe. And it was not just Germany, it was in Romania. It was not just German Nazis, it was the fascist Iron Guard in Romania that killed 75,000 Jewish people. So there were the perpetrators. And then there were the bystanders, those who were not Jewish. They were sympathetic, but they were concerned about their own safety and they wanted to help, but they were afraid. And so by being a bystander is another aspect of the Holocaust in all these countries where the Holocaust took place. And finally, there were the righteous, those that had the courage to stand up and do something and help their Jewish neighbor. It may have been Christian mothers who took Jewish children and hid them in Poland while their parents and grandparents were put on the trains to Auschwitz. The hidden children who were raised by by Christian families in Poland, for example. The example I'd like to show you is Hiram Bingham, a Foreign Service officer in Marseille, France, who was told by the Roosevelt administration State Department, don't issue any more visas to the poor Jewish families. We've had enough and it's politically sensitive here in the United States. He disregarded that. He saved over 2,000 Jewish people from France and Germany, people like Marc Chagall, the brother and son of Thomas Mann, Hannah Arendt. These were thinkers and writers and artists and just normal people, 2,000 people. He gave them a visa to come to the United States and save them. There's a tree in Yad Vashem with his name on it, to the righteous, and there are many others. Oskar Schindler, you may have seen Schindler's List. He has a tree there. He saved several thousand Jewish people. The King of Denmark saved 7,000 of the Jewish Danish citizens. So the righteous were the ones, and I'll talk about this later in the context of genocides today, those that do the right thing and don't be a bystander, be an upstander, speak out against hatred and bigotry. So in my tenure as Special Envoy, Ambassador for Holocaust Issues in the George Bush 43 administration, I really followed the work of Stuart Eisenstadt, the ambassador in the Clinton administration, who wanted to negotiate agreements with countries where the Holocaust took place to help Jewish and Holocaust survivors and also the families of the victims of the Holocaust. And so he negotiated a series of agreements where Romania and Serbia and Poland and others were able to come up with programs in which those Jewish families could try to apply for property that was stolen by the Nazis as they put the Jewish people on the trains. So Stuart Eisenstadt's a mentor of mine and did a lot to in terms of those the memory of the Holocaust. And then also I want to talk about chancellors of Germany. First, Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Germany, he was persecuted by the Nazis as being against the Nazi Party, and he was very early on recognized the importance of an apology on behalf of the German people. And that I've talked to Holocaust survivors, and that apology is really meaningful to them. And also Germany started a program of reparations for Israel. In 1956, the budget of Israel was something like 70% was provided by the German government to help Israel build itself as a country, the infrastructure. And then I want to talk about Joschka Fischer, who was a baby boomer born after World War II, a leader in the Green Party in the 1960s, and he understood as a German the responsibility. He was not a perpetrator, he was not guilty or responsible, it was a different generation, but he understood the responsibility of his in his leadership to do something for the Holocaust survivors and also the families of the victims. And he hosted, as foreign minister, a conference I went to on, this was in 2005, to speak out against anti-Semitism, which was coming back during the Second Intifada. And that's one thing I did for members of Congress they asked for a report on what's happening in terms of rising anti-Semitism, and I filed the first report in my office on anti-Semitism by country and what was happening, and to encourage those countries to speak out and counter that. And Tom Lantos, the only member of Congress who was a Holocaust survivor, asked for that quite appropriately. And so fighting anti-Semitism was the mission of Joschka Fischer as well. And then finally, Göran Persson, the Prime Minister of Sweden, who hosted conferences for all countries, members of the United Nations, on speaking out against hatred, bigotry, anti-Semitism, but also other forms. When we got together, we also were talking about speaking out against racism, Islamophobia, discrimination against Roma Sinti, because where there's anti-Semitism, there's also hatred, bigotry towards other groups, either religious or ethnic. Holocaust education, this is another thing that I worked on with other countries when I was in the role of ambassador for Holocaust issues. So we had a multilateral organization still today, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and we got together with my counterparts, other ambassadors from Poland and Romania and France, the Baltics countries, to talk about educating young people about what happened in the Holocaust. And this has to be done carefully with the advice of teachers, the message is don't be a bystander. Speak out in your generation to the students when you hear hatred, bigotry, anti-Semitism. And it's very important for young people to hear from Holocaust survivors like this gentleman here at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, talking to students about his experience, which personalizes it. It's not just a number of 6 million. You hear about him and his family and what happened to them. And these documentaries are important because there are about 120,000 Holocaust survivors today in Israel, another 40,000 in the United States, in Europe, another 40,000, but the biological clock is ticking. So we need to have those documentaries and the testimonies of each survivor. And Steven Spielberg has in the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation of those videos that can be, and also the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I think in Skokie, the Holocaust Center probably has those type of testimonies of what happened to the victims of the Holocaust. The other important aspect of the Holocaust for governments is remembrance. So every year at the United Nations, January 27th, there's a Holocaust Remembrance Day, where we come together and to never forget what happened. According to the Jewish calendar, in April, there's Yom HaShoah that takes place around the world in Israel, but also at our nation's capital, where members of Congress come together in the capital and remember, to not forget. And they also remember the U.S. military units that liberated concentration camps, to thank them for what they did to end the tragedy of the Holocaust. And then March of the Living and other remembrances are very important. It's part of that legacy of the Holocaust, so we don't forget. And finally, restitution of stolen property. This is one thing that Stuart Eisenstadt worked on, and I did as well. It was not only the most horrific crime of the murder of 6 million people, it was the greatest theft in history. As the Jewish people were put on the trains, the Germans took records. They took their jewelry, their clothing, their household goods, their apartments, and it was seized by the Nazis. And then also Jewish schools and synagogues and hospitals and so on. And those properties were later, under the Soviet Union, property of the communist state. So in the 1990s, it was time to restitute a measure of value. There's no way a Jewish family that came from Poland who had a house, an apartment, you could do that in today's dollars, 1 for 1. But at least a measure of justice to encourage the Polish government to pay something for that property that was taken that has value today. So restitution of property after the tragedy, it was very important, continues to be today, and there's an office in the State Department today of of Holocaust unresolved issues that's continuing this work on education, remembrance, and restitution. Sadly, today we have anti-Semitism and surging again in various countries around the world. And this was a poll in Europe a few years ago, but it's still the case that 1 in 4 Europeans believe Jewish people have too much influence in business. And then another 1 in 3, the question was, they believe that Jews use the Holocaust to advance their own positions and goals. In the United States, we also have the same phenomena, sadly, of anti-Semitism, where many 11% of Americans in this one poll believed it's okay to have neo-Nazi beliefs. This was a poll by the Claims Conference, Jewish Material Claims Conference. And then another 45%, according to this poll, could not name one concentration camp. They didn't know about the Holocaust. And so, again, the importance of education in schools. And sadly, we've had violent events, killing of Jewish people in synagogues in the United States. Most recently, the tragedy of 2 Israeli diplomats who were killed, murdered in front of the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. in May. And there's a series of these, sadly. I've just listed those from 2018, but this tragedy goes on in the form of anti-Semitism and persecution of Jewish neighbors by people who were anti-Semitic. We also saw it in the attack on the nation's capital, sadly, 2021, January 6th, with T-shirts like Camp Auschwitz and QAnon, and then 6 million were not enough. These are anti-Semitic, hateful people who appeared at our nation's capital, and sadly, that continues today. So it's not just about the Holocaust, but I wanted to start with that as sort of the beginning point, but also talk about genocides that are a part of our life today in this century. Certainly the Rwanda genocide, which I'll talk about in just a minute, which occurred in 1994, the genocide of the Yazidi people in 2014 in an ungovernable space between Iraq and Syria, perpetrated by the Islamic State and the jihadists there who killed Christians and Yazidis. Yazidis because they're different. They're a part of the Islamic faith, but they're not Sunni, they're not Shia. They're different, and that's why they were murdered. The Rohingya in Myanmar, the Muslim minority in Myanmar, and so it's happening today and still with us. After World War II, we said never again. We saw the end of the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, we were looking forward to a Europe whole and free and the peace dividend. But sadly, in Bosnia-Herzegovina and between Serbia and Croatia, there were ethnic hatreds that were centuries old, but they started again in a war between Serbia and Croatia, 1991, that went to 1995. And also, during that period, the U.S. foreign policy was, this is a European conflict, the Europeans should take the lead on solving it. Well, they didn't, and it just lingered, and it got worse, and then culminated with the genocide-like act in Srebrenica of the murder of 7,000 men and boys, Muslim men and boys, by Serbian forces. And that propelled the U.S. administration, President Clinton, to shift and realize that we had to get involved with both the threat of NATO power and that's the strength of our military, but to pursue democratic solutions. So we sent Ambassador Richard Holbrooke to negotiate an end to that conflict. And that was a success of diplomacy that was not easy, and it took months, but Ambassador Holbrooke was a skilled negotiator, and it culminated in the Dayton Agreement, which was not easy to get signed by the Serbian Milosevic, but the threat was that if you don't sign, we're going to use the U.S. military NATO forces. So it ended the conflict. 30 years later, there's still ethnic conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina between the ethnic groups. It's a fragile situation, but it ended the war and there hasn't been killing. So that was a success of diplomacy that was able to stop that conflict. That was a a war crime, it was crimes against humanity, and a genocide-like act of Srebrenica. The Rwanda genocide in 1994, the tragedy of almost 1 million people, Tutsis, who were murdered in the space of 90 days. And America and other countries were looking the other way. They were seized with Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they didn't act fast enough. And the genocide took place, perpetrated by Hutu extremists who murdered Tutsis and others in just a very short period. And so that was at the end of a civil war in Rwanda. 4 years later, President Clinton returned to Rwanda to apologize and say he wanted to pay respects on behalf of the American people, to the people who suffered, the victims of that genocide. And he said, we did not act quickly enough after the killings began. We should have called this genocide and taken action. We, meaning the community of nations, members of the United Nations, U.S. and other countries, France and other neighboring countries in Africa. There could have been an end to that killing more sooner, but sadly it did not take place. So let's talk about the definition of genocide. And I'm not a human rights lawyer, but I've got friends who are in that world, and I'm going to work through this with you in terms of the legal definition. There is international humanitarian law, the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It was signed by a number of countries in 1948. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer who understood the tragedy of the Holocaust because he had seen it in Poland, was the author and the driving force behind this. What this does is establish in international humanitarian law the requirement that nations declare a genocide when these 5 conditions are met. Each country decides on its own. The U.S. will, the Secretary of State will, in a conflict where people are dying, and will determine whether it's a genocide by following this. And I want you to look at this in terms of that second sentence. Genocide means any of the following acts, any of the 5. Any of the following acts committed with the intent. Intent is a key word here. Intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And then the examples are killing members of the group, serious bodily harm, mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, and number 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Think about that in a minute when I talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the transfer of 40,000 Ukrainian children to Russia, taking them from their families and their communities. So these are the conditions and the criteria, and again, it has to be in terms of both the genocidal act and the genocidal intent. So that's going to be important later in terms of human rights lawyers that look at this in governments. Senator Durbin has been especially active as a leader in the Senate, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to propose and then follow through on legislation, bipartisan, that made the acts of genocide illegal criminal activity under U.S. federal law. That is the implementation of our U.S. responsibility to implement the Genocide Convention. Without this, we couldn't try perpetrators in U.S. courts. But the Genocide Accountability Act with Senator Imhoff of Oklahoma, I think was the co-sponsor, Republican, and then Justice for Victims of the War Crimes Act 2022, and then still working, I think, on crimes against humanity. That has enabled prosecution of perpetrators of genocide or of crimes against humanity. For example, in Sierra Leone, one of the perpetrators, a dual citizen, Sierra Leone, U.S., is now in federal prison because of what he did in terms of crimes against humanity, because of this federal law. And then also 4 Russian soldiers have been indicted here in U.S. courts because of this criminal legislation under U.S. federal law. So now moving from genocide to another concept you hear in the news, crimes against humanity. So crimes against humanity is a part of the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And so it's crimes against humanity, meaning widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. Murder, extermination, enslavement, and so on. There's a number of criteria that would meet that definition. Crimes against humanity is a different type of atrocity crime. Generically, I call them atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, or war crimes. You also hear about ethnic cleansing. Well, there's no accepted legal definition, but experts in the United Nations talk about it as like in former Yugoslavia when the Serbs moved the Albanians out of their area, or this has taken place in other areas like the Rohingya people in Myanmar who were pushed out of their homes by the Burmese military government into Bangladesh. But it's about rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove the persons. And then finally, war crimes. You hear this in the news as well. Another concept in terms of international humanitarian law based on the 4 Geneva Conventions starting in 1949 after the World War II and 3 protocols. The U.S., other countries, Israel, and so on are acceded to this and are parties to this. And that's where war crimes are the basis of international humanitarian law to prosecute the perpetrators of war crimes. And so there's a long definition here, but I'm going to try to put it in layman terms that I can understand it. War crimes are essentially when protected persons or non-combatants are endangered, or objects when they're endangered in warfare. Objects would be like a housing complex or a school or a hospital when there's attacks on those non-combatant civilians. That's the whole purpose, that combatants in any international conflict or a national conflict in one country will take measures to protect the civilian population. So that's the legal definition, and what countries around the world, the United States included, have accepted as international humanitarian law, with the expectation and requirement that we do something about it once we declare genocide has taken place. Now, looking forward in our current century, after the tragedies of Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina, Secretary Madeleine Albright and William Cohen, a Democrat, Republican, came together and put together a task force and came up with best practices of how to stop and prevent genocide before it starts happening. And a lot of their 34 recommendations from this 2004 report have been implemented through legislation and of Congress. Congress has been very active in legislation speaking out against hatred, bigotry, and war crimes and genocide and different conflicts around the world. And then Ambassador Michael Polt, a friend of mine, career professionals like us who worked on human rights issues, we think our U.S. foreign policy should have in it human rights embedded as a part of our top priorities, not a kind of a side issue. It should certainly be there in terms of U.S. interests, but also because of our U.S. values. Human rights should be a part of at the top of our foreign policy. And then Special Advisor Alice Nduratu. I wanted to share this quote with you. She was the advisor to the UN Secretary General. She was a human rights activist in Africa from Kenya, and she understood the role of women in preventing genocide and or crimes against humanity, but also in conflicts like Sierra Leone, a civil war where crimes were committed. Women played an important role in bringing that to an end, and also perpetrators to justice. In fact, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the president of Liberia, received a Nobel Peace Prize for what she did, along with other women in Sierra Leone, to end that conflict. So women are important at the grassroots level of trying to head off violence and hatred. So today, what are the genocides that we're faced with around the world? Well, I mentioned 2014, the genocide of the Yazidi people in Iraq and Syria. It's still a fragile situation. The ISIL state, the jihadists are still there. So, and diplomats are watching this so it doesn't resurge. In 2021, President Trump, Secretary Pompeo declared that the persecution of the Uyghur people in China by the Han majority is a genocide. And they followed with economic sanctions against products that were produced in factories in that part of China, essentially slave labor, that were being exported to the United States and sold in Target and Walmart. So that's part of the implementation of the declaration of genocide to try to put pressure. Also, the managers of those factories that were persecuting the Uyghur people put them on lists where they would be could be arrested if they came to the United States. Their bank accounts would be frozen, and so on. So that's kind of the implementation of what to do governments about genocide. Myanmar. So that genocide was declared by the Secretary Anthony Blinken in 2022, and it's the persecution of in Myanmar, it is a Buddhist majority military junta that seized power, and because of the presence of Rohingya people who are Muslims, they're being persecuted because of their faith in a majority Buddhist country. Christians as well are being persecuted. So that was declared as a genocide. And again, sanctions, economic sanctions against the military junta members who are making those decisions. Ethiopia, Tigray, that was one of the worst human tragedies and suffering a few years ago in 2021. It ended with a ceasefire agreement brokered by the United Nations and some African leaders, but it's still fragile between the Ethiopian government, the Tigrayan minority, and it certainly was ethnic cleansing and war crimes. And then Sudan today, sadly, we're still faced with genocide against the RSW, a civil war that's really genocide as declared by President Biden in January 2025. So we're faced with these, so what do we do about it as a government, as a people? And I would add, I was in Afghanistan for 3 years as a U.S. advisor in the embassy, and whenever a mosque was blown up by the Taliban or ISIL-K, it was a Shia Hazara mosque. Those are the minority people in Afghanistan. Crime against humanity that's still being perpetrated by the Taliban against the Hazara minority. So in our founding documents, human rights is centered on the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and has been a part of our nation. And I think that must continue in terms of the State Department and engagement to commit to human rights and atrocity prevention. President Biden, several years ago as vice president, said something that I and others agree with, that genocide and crimes against humanity can be prevented, but many times we miss opportunities early on to stop it when it's growing, when it's hatred, bigotry, discrimination against minorities. So we've missed opportunities, meaning the United States, other governments, local governments. In the first instance, local governments should have responsibility for stopping it in their country. President Trump, in his inaugural address, said, "My proudest legacy will be a peacemaker and unifier." So that's what I want to be. Well, he has certainly worked as a priority to try to bring a ceasefire to the conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and negotiations with Putin. He also has his 20-point peace plan to end the war in Gaza, which we hope is going to have success, but it's a fragile process, and I can talk about that in a minute a little bit more. And then also he claims to have helped bring an end to some conflicts, the border war between Thailand and Cambodia, also between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and then also some other conflicts that he did have a role in trying to bring those conflicts to a ceasefire. And also, I think he should get credit for the Abraham Accords that allowed Israel to have diplomatic relations with its neighbors. And we'd like to build on that, and hopefully that can be done in the future to give Israel confidence that they're safe and recognized as a state by their neighbors. Then also a significant setback, the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and culminated with the bomber strikes against the Iran nuclear program, which of course was an existential threat to Israel at that time. However, here are my concerns, and I'm speaking personally as a former diplomat, not for the State Department or Arizona State University, but my concerns about what's happening since January 20th are the following: that we have limited our ability to have an early warning system to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity. In the first instance, by dismantling and making U.S. Agency for International Development much smaller. As an organization, it's gone. President Trump went from 5,000 experts in stabilization and working around the world in conflict countries, called them home. There are 800 of those still working, from 5,000 to 800, and now they're in the State Department, and they're managing a much smaller foreign assistance program centered on disaster relief and different priorities. But I fear for what's happening in those countries that are unstable, that used to have AID presence, that help provide clean water and food and education and democracy training in countries around the world. That's gone. I'm concerned about that. Also, layoff of State Department experts, 3,500 State Department experts who've been engaged, like I was in my career, with human rights engagement. They are now gone, that expertise. And then also downsizing the ability to prevent genocide. The experts in the bureaus that were focused on that, like this one, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. Up till just a few months ago, this was 250 professionals who spoke foreign languages and knew countries in conflict and could go out. This young woman is a stabilization officer who came from Washington to meet with community leaders in Chad. And notice the presence of women there. And she was working to bring groups together before it becomes violent conflict between groups competing over power, politics, water, land. That bureau is now gone. And those experts, unfortunately, are not there anymore. So that early warning system that works overseas to try to prevent genocide before it happens, very small. And there's not a lot of transparency to find out what that commitment is to human rights today in today's State Department. I worry about that. The war in Gaza, let's talk about that. That's in the news, and you're reading about it. And the question is what is it in terms of Israel and the Israeli Defense Force operations in Gaza? The Israeli perspective is that they need to eliminate Hamas. It's an existential threat to the security of Israel and the people of Israel. And they're basing it on the long history of Israel since its foundation in 1948. And, for example, down there, the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel's neighbors, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, invaded Israel with the intent of destroying the government and the existence of the Israeli state. 1970, the Yom Kippur War, 1973, same thing, invasion of Israel by Egypt and Syria. Two intifadas, two military conflicts in Lebanon, Hezbollah and Iran missile attacks, and most recently the October 7th Hamas attack. That Israel sees as an existential threat to their existence, and deep-seated in Israelis is that needs to stop. They want to live in peace and know that they can live as a country in safety. And then The Israeli perspective is saying that these military operations are consistent with international humanitarian law. That's the Israeli point of view. What about the October 7th Hamas attack? Well, there are 300 legal scholars that say probably it constitutes the crime of genocide and meets the criteria. 1,200 Israelis and foreigners killed, 5,431 injured, and so should Hamas be held accountable? They're a terrorist organization, they're not a state, but the Palestinian Authority is actually a non-member of the United Nations, recognized as a state by many countries. They signed the Genocide Convention. They also signed the Rome Treaty. So legal scholars ask, why doesn't one of the countries bring that case to the International Court of Justice to see if it is in actuality crimes against humanity or war crimes or genocide? The scholar I'm going to quote is Ambassador David Sheffer. He's a practitioner and also a human rights scholar. He works with me at Arizona State University. He actually was a professor in the law school at Northwestern, headed the International Human Rights Division of that. He was the first ambassador for war crimes in the State Department. And you'll see him on CNN and CBS talking about the legal issues of genocide, war crimes, and so on. On CNN, on CBS, look for him because he will be able to fill in much more eloquent detail than I these issues of when does genocide occur, when it is a war crime, when it is crimes against humanity. And he just published a book I would recommend to you, 5 Pillars for Humankind, about the UN Charter. He actually talked to the World Affairs Council here in Central Illinois about 10 or 15 years ago when he was at Northwestern. So I talked to him before I came here, and he helped me kind of frame this for you. But he's available. You can look at his podcast and interviews on Council on Foreign Relations. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So going back to the war in Gaza, Israel. So is it genocide? The International Association of Genocide Scholars say yes. They don't talk about intent, that intent was there. They say the totality and outcome demonstrates genocide. But there are other scholars that say no, it does not satisfy that intent. In terms of the International Court of Justice, the indictments against Prime Minister Netanyahu are about crimes against humanity and war crimes. So that's a lower barrier, a lower standard in terms of not having to demonstrate about the intent. What about the Palestinian people, the people in Gaza? Under the Trump peace plan, we've had a reported 67,000 Gazans killed, 80% of Gaza infrastructure destroyed. I think countries around the world and people want to bring peace, stability to the people of Gaza. Starvation and rebuilding infrastructure important. So what about a civilian authority? How do we structure it so that there is a civilian authority responsible to the people of Gaza and replacing the terrorism of Hamas, and then disarming Hamas, another hurdle to be jumped over in this 20-point peace plan, but it's important. It's too important to fail, as Jared Kushner and the negotiators said most recently in an interview that I saw. And then, of course, there's distrust on both sides. So you need a mediator, someone both sides trust. And for now, it looks like that's President Trump, along with the backing of the Arab countries, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So hopefully, let's hope that peace and the ceasefire will prevail. So finally, Russia's war in Ukraine. Now this one is pretty straightforward in my view, personal view. It was unprovoked, it was illegal, it was an aggressive war against Ukraine, an invasion of a sovereign country by Russia. Genocide, that number 5 criteria I showed you, kidnapping of Ukrainian children. To her credit, Melania Trump has called out Putin, according to a press article I read, and said, return those children. Well, let's hope that results in something that will bring those children home to their families and their communities. Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court, crimes against humanity and war crimes. So there's an indictment. And then also I mentioned the prosecution of Russian soldiers. There have been some as well, prisoners of war, who have been indicted in Ukrainian courts of perpetration of war crimes as well. The Ukrainians have assembled documentary proof of genocide or war crimes, 53,000 documented incidents, and they got help from human rights scholars and also diplomats like from the U.S. and other countries to lay that basis for a legal prosecution of the perpetrators of war crimes. So to conclude, here are my lessons from history about how to prevent genocide. Number one, the responsibility of the individuals. In the countries where this is happening, or in the community wherever anti-Semitism or hatred, bigotry, Islamophobia, speak out before it becomes persecution and accelerates. So it's the responsibility of the individuals to do something, be an upstander, speak out. Secondly, the country where the tragedy is happening should have the rule of law, and also the government is responsible for stopping it in the first instance. Sadly, some of these genocides are state-sponsored, so the problem is the government, like in Myanmar. But then other countries under the Genocide Convention have the responsibility under humanitarian law. United States and all those that signed on to the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, and so on, have that same responsibility. But yet that law is there, but then it needs the political will of the leaders to take action, to implement that law and to bring those perpetrators to justice. And then finally, the important role of non-governmental organization, Amnesty International, Human Rights First, who are around the world at the grassroots level, an early warning system of when hatred, bigotry happens. And then academics, researchers, think tanks, Holocaust scholars, also a part of this. But this all underlines my basic message to you, global engagement. As a career Foreign Service officer, I think the United States is certainly a world power, and we should be engaged. We are generous enough and we care about human rights. It's a part of our values. It's not only about our interests, it's about our values of our country. And I think that those values also make America great. Thank you.
We will open the floor for questions. Well, we've got one right here in front.
Very short question. Wouldn't the United States have greater leverage if it were a party to the International Criminal Court?
That is an argument, yes, and we are not. Yeah, I'm sorry. The United States is not a party to the Rome treaties, the Rome Statute in 1998 that created the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Court of Justice, and so on. And the question was, wouldn't we have more leverage, influence if we were members? And certainly David Sheffer, who led the U.S. delegation to the Rome Treaty in 1998 to establish the International Criminal Court, very much believes we should have become a party to it, and he still says that today. However, there was not the support from members of Congress who concerned about our sovereignty. And the argument goes, we are a country of laws and a rule of law. We have a strong system. In our military has a universal code of military justice. And every soldier, when I was in the Army, we were told, what is a war crime? And we had to be responsible to following to not commit war crimes of the Geneva Convention. So we have a strong legal system, and they didn't, and the opposition to us joining the court was that we felt that there would be politically motivated cases brought against our soldiers in Afghanistan, but that where they would be tried by a court different than the United States. And the second part of that, we do have courts, military courts, the Universal Court of Military Justice that tries soldiers under those same statutes. So that's the dilemma, and that was the outcome. But David Sheffer clearly and other legal scholars feel, but it's the same thing, the sovereignty issue, the law of the sea. We've never become a party to the law of the sea because of sovereignty, and that's been played out in Congress over the years.
So I know there's a lot of different students here, like high school students and college students. What are ways that, since we are not political figures, what are ways that we can get involved and bring change? Or for younger people in general?
Involved in?
Spreading awareness or help bringing change at all in the government.
Okay. So the question was, how can students in college or high school bring change and be a part of this? And that's where, I was happy to talk to the students a little bit before this, and thank you for that question. And the point I made then was that you can, within your community, first of all, within your friends group, when you hear comments of hatred, bigotry, doesn't have to, it could be anti-Semitism, it could be racism, it could be Islamophobia. Speak out, don't be silent. Start there in your own daily life. And then make your views known. I mean, you're the leaders of the future. So my generation, passing the torch to you, we've made mistakes, but hopefully you will be able to also focus on our values as a country of human rights and talk to your representatives in Congress who represent you, who want to hear your views. Speak out to those representatives in Congress and write editorials in the school newspaper, get together groups, welcome refugees and asylees. There's a number of Syrian and Ukrainian and Afghan people here in the United States that are starting their lives all over again, and they need help in restarting their lives. They've lost everything where they came from, and they can't go back. And they're here, so you can help them and learn about what they suffered, and as a way of informing yourself. So look to the future, and thanks for that question.
In the Hamas situation, Netanyahu believes that if they're not totally wiped out and destroyed, Israel will never be in peace. The other side is Machiavelli, and he says for every person killed, like in Hamas, 10 will rise to avenge. Best example I saw maybe a week ago or less. They grabbed people, they blindfolded them, and then they assassinated them in public in revenge for what is going on. How can there ever be peace?
I don't have an answer for you, but I have hope. And it starts with a ceasefire. And then hopefully we can build from there. There are various views of I'm no expert on Hamas and how they work, but from what I hear from others who are closer to this, that there are various, it's not a completely organization that has the same view in all aspects. You have the fighters in the tunnels, you have the negotiators in Qatar, and there's not communication always between the two. So what's agreed at the negotiating table may not be implemented. And there's disruptors. Condoleezza Rice talked about that when she was interviewed by Norah O'Donnell, along with Hillary Clinton. And both Hillary Clinton and Norah O'Donnell said there are going to be disruptors, both among the Hamas who come out and kill, like the incident you talked about, where they murdered Palestinians who they accused of collaborating or not being in line with the Hamas ideology, whatever, we don't know. On the other side, there could be disruptors in Israel who want to keep fighting till every last Hamas fighter. But at some point, ceasefire, and then we move to the question I asked civilian authority and who's going to represent the Palestinian people in Gaza, because we know it's not Hamas. They're still a terrorist organization. They have not changed. Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Houthis, all still, their one priority is destruction of the nation of Israel. That hasn't changed. I've seen nothing in the press about them changing their position. So when that's the case, yeah, I mean, the Israeli government has to worry about their existential threat. But I think we've moved, hopefully, past that in terms of where we are with Prime Minister Netanyahu agreeing to the 20-point peace plan and moving ahead on the ceasefire. So I hope that's where it is, but it's a hope.
I have a question. This is actually from a WACI member who's unable to come tonight, who asked me to ask you, do you believe that since you started working on this issue, which was under George Bush the first, has there been improvement? Has this awareness, these statutes, these decision definitions helped prevent genocide? What is the trend?
Yes, I do. I think there has been progress. We are in a much better position now, thanks to these conventions which we've acceded to, and also legislation from Congress over the years since Bosnia and Herzegovina and Rwanda. So we have the tools and we have the diplomatic engagement that can be done, soft power, but it takes political will to do that, and it takes the people who understand how to that early warning system, and it's not just diplomats, it's also NGOs and so on. And I think there are best practices that have been, there are examples. Samantha Power, who was the U.S. ambassador in the Obama administration to the United Nations, a human rights activist. Read her book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, and also another book she wrote. But she talks about in the Obama administration that there were countries in Africa where the dictator was going to overstay. He'd been defeated and he was going to leave. President Obama put pressure. He left. It's hard to quantify when a tragedy doesn't happen, when you head it off. There's no statistics on what didn't happen. We have statistics on the tragedies. But I'm convinced there are instances around the world, like Richard Holbrooke, that brought an end to the conflict in the Balkans. There have been successes of diplomacy, but they're too far, and we need to keep engaged in the world to head it off with soft power. And so we don't have to use military power, or the tragedy continues without end. So that would be my view.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask, just because you did serve in Germany, why do you think we've seen this uptick in conservative extremism in Germany in recent years?
The question is, why have we seen an uptick in the radical sort of right, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party, which is now polling in some parts of Germany at 30%, more than the Social Democrats. And that's really worrisome to Germans, and it comes from primarily East Germany, where there is also that historic, deep-seated anti-Semitism that goes back centuries. And there's anti-Semitism where Jewish people don't live, and that's the case. There are very few, if any, Jewish people in East Germany. There are Jewish communities that have grown in parts of in Frankfurt, Berlin, different parts of Germany, but it's about the anti-other, or the Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2015 brought in over 1 million refugees from Afghanistan, Syria, and other countries at risk, and that was very generous of her. But it caused stress and that kickback, unfortunately, of the anti-immigrant, and that's seen in the right, the extreme right. And there are some of the leaders in that party, not all, but some of them are clearly anti-Semitic, and some would say neo-Nazi. So it's worrisome.
The ambassador, have you seen a regression in attitude toward immigration and welcoming the strangers over the past few years?
Yeah, about immigration and the changes over the last few years. And yes, I worry about that too. Speaking personally, I think we should be generous and receive those, especially I have a close a place in my heart for Afghan people who worked with me when I was in the Ministry of Counter Narcotics, who risked their lives. Some of them were translators for the U.S. military, and they have been coming in under the Special Immigrant Visa Program, but that has been slowed to a trickle. And I think we owe them for what they were trying to do for their own country. They laid down their lives, many of them, for fighting the Taliban to make Afghanistan a better place in women's rights and so on. But yes, there has been a cutback in asylee, in refugee numbers. It actually started in the first Trump administration. President Biden did try to increase the numbers of asylees back up to 125,000. This required coordination with Congress as well and funding. But yes, I'm sorry to say that we are not as welcoming as seen by the rest of the world. And I hope we can return to a place where we can be more generous and welcome people who are at risk, who going back to that country, whether they're Afghans or from Myanmar, Rohingya people, that they can seek refuge here. And also, I should say, other countries should be generous about accepting refugees, and many are not. Many of the Muslim countries could be accepting more asylees and refugees. I think I've got some music here. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Oh, there's one back there, yes.
I hope I didn't miss this, but you started with a discussion of the Holocaust and the use of genocide in terms of the characterization of what happened at that point. Do you think it's helpful to continue to have a debate, and I'm particularly thinking about the Gaza situation without giving an opinion on it? Do you think it's helpful to continue to have a debate on whether or not that is genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity? You know, is that helpful, and is there something we should be looking at more carefully in order to understand what's going on there than the terminology provides to us?
So the question is, should we continue to have the debate about in Gaza whether it's genocide or war crimes, or is there something more productive that we can focus on? And I think for legal scholars and leaders, in our responsibility to those UN agreements that we signed on to, I think there's a place for that. But it's going to take time. This is going to take years to investigate each incident and come up with decisions according to international humanitarian law. But most urgently, I think our focus should be on stop the killing, a ceasefire. And then one step at a time, much like Secretary Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton talked about, that it's too important to fail. We need to keep moving toward stopping the killing. And then later, there should be accountability of the perpetrators. I mean, there's still perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide that have not been brought to justice. Same thing in Serbia. Some of the perpetrators have not been brought to justice. So it's a process, and it's not perfect. And then I want to also mention reconciliation. At some point in this process, hopefully there can be a reconciliation between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. And there are good people who have been doing that over the decades, I know, in special NGO-supported, bringing young people together, Palestinian and Israelis, to hear each other out and the other's point of view in a respectful, non-violent, but a constructive dialogue. So reconciliation has been attempted in South Africa. There's some lessons learned there after apartheid. Also in Rwanda, there have been reconciliation commissions to try to bring the Hutus, Tutsis together And there's still struggle, and it's not perfect, but I think that's another thing we can focus on as a part of this. Beyond defining whether or not legal definitions, I mean, that is important, should continue, but there are other things I think are important too. And I think David Sheffer would agree with me on that.
Yes, I was wondering if you could speak to what seems to be almost like the trend of people misusing the word genocide. If you can address that, please, because I think there are people that just use it, they don't understand what it means, they're misinformed, and it just becomes such a popular term. And I just wanted to know if you could address that.
Yeah, well, I actually tried to address it today, and it does concern me that it's used widely in the press and media without much definition. And I wanted to go through this, even though it's very much in the details of law, but yet, yeah, I do worry about that. The press use of terms like war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide, sort of almost interchangeably, if they're not. I mean, it's a responsibility of the press to be able to focus on the correct issue of what they want to be reporting about. But I think that's a work in progress. That's a good question. Thank you.
What do you think would be the best way to go about spreading awareness about the sudden increase in neo-Nazism and bigotry in our communities?
Thank you. What's the best way to speak out against the spread of neo-Nazism and hatred, bigotry in your community? Well, again, it starts with the individual, and whenever you hear that, speak out. And so it's I think that's the first point. And then teachers, administrators in schools, or leaders in the community should speak out against hatred, bigotry. I mean, there's a balance here between free speech, which under free speech, that kind of neo-Nazi, Nazi swastika symbols, but but it doesn't mean that you can't speak out against it. In Germany, it's criminal activity, the German swastika, or anti-Semitic comments and so on. But we have a different system with free speech that protects that. But still, that doesn't mean you can't speak out, and that leaders in our communities should speak out, in my view, and individuals as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So on behalf of our members and our council, we would like to gift you this book, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle by John Meacham. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.